One of the most daunting tasks, it seems to me, is to come before a sophisticated, knowledgeable audience such as this one and try to introduce someone that they all know and has been in their midst for a half century and has left all kinds of tracks. And what are you going to say that they don't already know? But that's my job tonight, and I'm going to take the next 3 or 4 minutes to try to maybe come up with 1 or 2 things that were in our minds when we decided we would like to honor Senator Pat Roberts tonight. This is a man who came from 2 root sources, it seems to me, journalism and politics. His great-grandfather, J.W. Roberts, founded the first or the second, maybe it was, a newspaper in the state of Oklahoma. And his father, Wes Roberts, was the RNC chairman under Dwight Eisenhower. And so maybe, I don't know what happened over the dinner table, but my guess is that some of that got infused into the young Pat Roberts. Now he got, not all, notwithstanding, he had an inauspicious beginning, it seems to me. He went to college at an obscure little school out there in the middle of Kansas someplace, a modest place with much to be modest about. Now, had he gone to a more prestigious school, such as my alma mater and University of Kansas, he may well be our president now. But the next thing he did after graduation, he did the right thing. He went to the military, to serve his country, and I tip my hat to that. But he went to the Marine Corps. Had he had 20/20 vision, he might have been able to get in the Air Force. And 4 years in the Marine Corps, off he goes to journalism, following that journalism piece. Reporter, editor of numerous papers, and then I think the draw to national service set in, and he came to the city, and he's been here ever since. First as a staffer and up through the staff ranks, then 8 times as a congressman in the House of Representatives, and now he's in the middle of his 4th term as a United States Senator. He's left some tracks. Many of you think, I'm sure, that we identify him, first of all, as an agricultural guy, and he certainly is that. He's the only guy in history that has chaired both the ag committees in the House and the Senate, and I think he's also been the ranking minority in both of those as well. But that's not, and not to say that agriculture doesn't have anything to do with national security, it certainly does. But it's that hardcore stuff that tweaks at my heartstrings, and I think it's the reason we really focused on this man to honor tonight. I'm going to tell you 2 things and then get off the stage. You didn't come to listen to me talk. One is that I was the executive director of a national security blue ribbon commission called the Hart-Rudman Commission. Many of you know it. The most comprehensive review that any group such as that has done on trying to determine what this nation's national security apparatus ought to be for the 21st century since the National Security Act of 1947. Bipartisan. And as we got underway in trying to analyze what kind of a world we're going to live in and what kind of a national security apparatus we ought to have and what kind of transformations needed to take place in those institutions, the structures and the processes by which the nation formulates and executes. We went to the Senate to find people who might pass their wisdom on and that we might build some kind of support base for what we came up with eventually that would have to be implemented into law. It's a sad thing to say, but there was only one United States Senator, only one, who got interested in and started right almost from the beginning, through the analytical process, through the conclusions, through the what ought we do about it. And that was Pat Roberts. stayed with us all the way. And then afterward, when we rolled out in January of 2001, a set of recommendations, warnings, Americans are going to die on their own soil, probably in large numbers, not much interest. And so then he started having hearings and trying to bring attention to this important piece of work, the only man to do so in the United States Senate. 2 House representatives, by the way, both wonderful men, Ike Skelton, may he rest in peace, and Mac Thornberry, who is now the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. Number 2, during that terribly critical period when the nation had suffered intelligence failures of a huge magnitude, Pat Roberts was the chairman of the Senate Select Committee and dealt with that period and dealt with reform issues and dealt with what we ought to do about the intelligence community in a way that brought both admiration and deep appreciation from me and I think thousands of other people, professionals. And he did it without grandstanding. He did it without grandstanding. He'll have my respect forever for that. It seems to me that I can think of nobody I'd rather have tonight in this room. And by the way, Tim Kaine, I am a great fan of Tim Kaine. At AUMF, he's the only guy doing it as far as I can tell, and it's hugely important. And my tip of the hat, and I'm trying to encourage him to keep on, don't be discouraged. So we're going to introduce Senator Pat Roberts, a man I admire immensely.
Everybody before me has spoken off the cuff, indicating tremendous organization, power of concentration, wit, humor, and pertinence. I, on the other hand, have some prepared remarks. These are prepared by staff out of sheer fear of what I might say off the cuff. Dimitri, I think we have broken new ground. Where'd you go? Where's Dimitri? Right there in front of me. You have a senator that has been in the Senate, now entering his 4th term, me, and we have as guests two vice presidents sitting right over here, Tim Kaine and Jeff Sessions. If you guys want to get together and just solve all this, why, it'd be very helpful. Tim came up to me, and I recognized him immediately. And I said, golly, it's been a long time since we visited. And I remember when you were president of the Pi Kappa Alpha chapter at Kansas State University and all of this. And then all of a sudden I looked at him, I said, oh, wait a minute, that's your dad. I want to talk about a bummer. Tim is actually not a Democrat, he's just a confused Republican. All Republicans today are confused. Chuck, it was not today, but there was a day with 20/20 hindsight that I did join the United States Marine Corps, as opposed to the service that you achieved notoriety, fame, and well-deserved accolades. I have some remarks in here that go back to that. The other rather unfortunate thing that Chuck said is that something about where one went to school. And I have to say that I did go to Kansas State University, home of the ever-optimistic and fighting Wildcats. where we still play football, as to the other school mentioned. And I would have gone to that other school by Baker. I think it's over by Baker. And but I would have gone to that school, but my visa ran out about in Douglas County about, I don't know. Well, I know when it ran out. It certainly ran out in the last election. But that's neither here nor there. My two girls went to KU. My son went to K-State. I went to K-State. My dad went to K-State. My daughter, Ashley, who had the temerity to say in a public meeting, "Why did you go to KU?" She said, "Better gene pool." But I had to write checks to your school. But I couldn't. My hand cramped. So Frankie, this very lovely blonde singing in front of you, my wife of 46 years, Frankie, why don't you just stand if you would do so, please. All right, I got to tell the story since these remarks don't amount to much, and I might as well just, keep on a roll here. I got to tell the story. Honey, please don't be upset with this, but she worked for Strom Thurmond, and I was working for Frank Carlson. And so then I thought it was very cute after we became married and we would be introduced, and I would say that basically she got too old for Strom and had to settle for me. Now, see, that got a laugh, right? Good for the evening, not very good later on. So at the time that I was, we were just being introduced as the new class of 80. We were the Reagan robots that were elected to the Senate. And so I stood up and said that. And she, without, just stood right up and she says, "And now I have my own Strom Thurmond." That should have got a bigger laugh than the other. I'd have been in trouble again. You want to try it again and I'll just stay out of trouble? All right. Thank you so much for the honor that you have given me this evening. Special moment in my career to be receiving the Distinguished Service Award along with my good friends and colleagues, Senator Tim Kaine. And then we have the conscience of the Senate with regards to spending dollars that we don't have. Senator Sessions, who I used to, in the role of acting presiding officer, recognize him as the senator from Georgia. Once. At any rate, a very prestigious organization, Center for the National Interest. General Boyd, Dimitri, you have been important voices in this city for over 2 decades. Think about that. In behalf of national security and individual freedoms, and I feel very privileged to be with you this evening and part of this organization. To me, the first and most important duty of any member of Congress is to ensure the security of the United States. I repeat that a lot when I'm out on the trail in Kansas, mostly western Kansas. And throughout my time in Congress, that's spanning 16 years in the House, 20 in the Senate, where does the time go? This is from a guy that said I'd only be here 1 year. The only duty and then met this little blue-eyed magnolia blossom from South Carolina. I'm trying to get back from that other question. The only duty I have cherished more was my time in the United States Marine Corps. Those who know me would expect me to say that. It was by far, I think, the hardest thing that I ever had to do in my life. But nothing prepares you for the combat of politics like wearing the nation's uniform, especially if it has a globe and anchor on it. As a Marine, I learned the value and the ability of leadership above politics, and I've worked hard, very hard in my career to employ that lesson. Today, as this nation is faced with threats from across the globe, I think we're fortunate to have the best fighting force in the world. This reminds me That's a line we always use and should use, and we're proud of saying that. But being a chairman in several occasions, there's always a bill you have to support. You always stand up and say, well, this is not the best, pardon me, this is not the best possible bill, that's the best bill possible. So when we say the best fighting force in the world, that does not mean that we have an adequate investment in that fighting force. We have really procured the most sophisticated weaponry, and we are deploying in our hardworking men and women in uniform to every corner of the world, training local forces and protecting our way of life. My staff assistant Theda is here, went to Baghdad right after the 2014 election. I thought it was safer in Baghdad than in Kansas. And we went to Baghdad, and then we were invited up to Erbil, and that was the intellectual center of what we were operating with the attack on Mount Sinjar, freeing Christians from Mount Sinjar, and we were successful in that effort. It was quite an operation, and I think that's trying to be replicated with regards to not only Iraq, but in other places of the world. So, yeah, we have boots on the ground. We have boots on the ground, and they're very special. And they're doing a great job given the situation that they are in. Now, for several years under the Bush administration, as alleged to previously, I had the unique responsibility of serving in the United States Senate and on the Intelligence Committee as its chairman. It was not an easy task. At times, our committee was at odds with the president and many in the intelligence community. We did, in fact, experience a worldwide intelligence failure with regards to whether or not Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He did not. Interestingly enough, he thought he did because nobody ever came in to tell him he didn't. I think you can understand that. One Republican guard thought the other Republican guard had it and went vice versa. Well, we strove to make things better, easier, more incorporated among the towering silos that existed across our intelligence community. Our committee's work served as a blueprint for the 9/11 Commission. Prior to that, I was privileged to serve with my esteemed friend from the University of Kansas. And we worked on that committee, which was made up of prior experts and also former senators and former members of Congress who were not given to precise commentary. So Mac Thornberry and I and Ike Skelton attended as best we could. Really, that, I think, became a blueprint for what we did down the road in the Intelligence Committee. And then I think our committee's work served as a blueprint for the 9/11 Commission. As a matter of fact, I know that. As chairman, I oversaw sweeping changes to national security practices in hopes of stopping another 9/11 from happening. As we all know, the inability of some of our agencies to share information really impaired our attempts and ability to prevent the fateful attacks on that day. I am very proud of the progress our nation is making with regard to food and agriculture security. You knew I would bring that up. This has been a focus and passion of mine since 1999. As the very first chairman of the Emerging Threats Subcommittee under John Warner, on the Senate Armed Services Committee, I was able to travel to Russia and see firsthand their secret cities under the Nunn-Lugar program. My wife Frankie and I attended. What I saw, or what we saw, was astonishing, quite frightening. Stockpiles, and I'm talking about stockpiles in warehouses, full of anthrax, hoof and mouth, avian influenza, you name it. Every deadly pathogen we had long feared in the agriculture community was warehoused, unsecured, ready to be weaponized. Talk about the evil empire. I returned from that trip determined to ensure that America's plant and animal sector would never be vulnerable to one of these deadly pathogens. I held hearings in the Emerging Threats Subcommittee. I worked with the Intelligence Committee to raise the threat level of agri-terrorism. A lot of farmers didn't want to hear me talk about agritourism, but I felt that that was absolutely essential. I lobbied hard for a new national agro and biodefense laboratory that could protect our farmers and ranchers and consumers and everybody else from an intentional introduction of a very deadly disease. And we saw firsthand when we conducted an exercise known as Crimson Sky, where I played the President of the United States. Nobody else was in town, so, played the President of the United States. I actually fired somebody. I think I fired the Secretary of Commerce. God, that felt good. And as soon as the disease spread among one herd of cattle to another, to another, to another, which I stopped the movement of all cattle. Our borders shut. All exports were stopped. Every export. I'm not talking about just beef. I'm not talking about ag products. I'm talking about every export stopped. And our food supply was in danger. People finally learned that their food did not come from grocery stores, and so amassed in the grocery stores to the point that we didn't have any food. This was a very jarring and eye-opening exercise. 17 years later, I am proud to say that we as a nation are finally taking the steps necessary to protect our nation's agriculture and livestock from an outbreak, which would decimate our exports economy, not to mention our food supply. The National Bio and Agro Defense Facility is under construction today in Manhattan, Kansas. The critical national importance of having such a laboratory reflected the true national security threat of agritourism. And I want to say one thing in behalf of Tim and Jeff. They know this, I know this. You don't get this done 17 years, my God. I thought I could do it in 2 years. You have to do it bipartisan. You must do it in bipartisan. You have to get in touch and do your work and pull on the coat of somebody and say, will you sit down with me and at least for 25 seconds listen to what I have to say about a threat that I think is very, very critical. That has to be bipartisan. And that reflects my best moments on this journey have been where both parties were able to put aside their differences and work for our vital national security interests. National security should always remain the first duty of every individual who has the privilege to serve this nation and the Congress regardless of party. It has certainly been my honor and privilege to serve on the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senate Intelligence Committee. So I close with a quote from the report by the Commission on America's National Interest. Tim said we ought to get together. Maybe we ought to try and assess what others have assessed before us have done. How can we build a consensus, if you will, a bipartisan consensus? It's all right here. It was in 1996, America's National Interest, the Commission on America's National Interest. That's where I took that quote from. And they did a unique thing. They took our vital interests and then our not so vital interests and down the road, and they played a poker game, and they put in blue chips, red chips, white chips, translucent chips. You read these blue chip recommendations in terms of what our vital national interests are today. Ladies and gentlemen, they're the same thing that we're talking about today. And some of the things that they point out, they say that we have to do. We haven't done them. We haven't done them. I'm not pointing any fingers. We're all involved here. And it's not going to be solved unless we get a group like this, and I think I know which one I would pick. I'm a member of the group. And take a look at this and see if we would update it. Let me point out that there's a expression in Dodge City, Kansas, that if you want to be a big flea, you have to run with tall dogs. That's supposed to be a little bit of a laughter after that. Co-chairs Robert Ellsworth, Andrew Goodpasture, Rita Hauser. Executive directors, Gordon Allison Jr., Dimitri Simes, James Thompson. Members, Rich Armitage, Jeffrey Eisen, David Gergen, we all remember him. He was talking about international affairs when he wasn't arranging who was going to play tennis at the White House, Gerald Green, Jeffrey Kemp, John McCain, everybody knows John personally, Condoleezza Rice, Robert Blackwell, Richard Falkenrath, Bob Graham, former chairman of the committee on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Arnold Cantor, Paul Krugman, of course, and then some guy named Roberts who was put between Sam Nunn and Brent Scowcroft, who I remember at the time said this. We were all sitting around a table. I was very privileged to be in the room, discussing what we were going to do with Iraq and what would be the appropriate responses. And it had gotten to the point where we all knew that where the administration wanted to go. Mr. Scowcroft, General Scowcroft, said, America, when it goes into a country, doesn't ask much. We would like to have the remains of those who paid the ultimate sacrifice. If that's not the case, perhaps in the National Cemetery in your country. We don't ask for anything else. But when we push Humpty Dumpty off the wall, which is what you do when you go into combat, you go into a particular mission, and that mission involves warfare. And Humpty Dumpty goes off the wall, i.e. Saddam Hussein. We have an obligation to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. That's what we do. And my question to everybody in the room is, when we win, what do we win? That's a question today that I, at that time, stuck with me, and when it came time for me to vote, I still had the question in the back of my mind. Should be the question we have in the back of our mind today. Either way, no matter which way it goes, I think it was good advice. So I am suggesting that you might want to take a look at this, try to renew the effort, try to get bipartisan support. We have two good men in the audience here along with me that I know that will be very conducive to any recommendations that we might want to make. I also want to thank everybody in this room for your contribution to what I did when I put up my hand swearing that I would do everything in my power to serve the Marine Corps in the best honorable way. For all that you have done individually. You're all heroes or heroines, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate the interest, something that doesn't come popping up all the time in the town hall meetings in Kansas as opposed to the overregulation problem that we have, but that every American shares today, that we're adrift, that we're not quite sure. You all can help in this regard. I'm expecting it. I hope that you will come forth with your best suggestions and stay involved. Please don't stay on the sidelines. Get in the field. Thank you very much.